It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch event of the 2021 State of the Tucson Food System Report, focused on assessing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Southern Arizona. My name is Laurel Volante. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Regional Food Studies at the University of Arizona. This semester, I've been acting director of the center while Dr. Megan Carney, the center's director, has been on sabbatical. I am joined by my wonderful collaborators on this project, Dr. Gigi Owen, research scientist with the climate assessment for the Southwest program at the University of Arizona, Eden Kincaid, PhD candidate in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment, and Sean McCabe, who is a Coverdell Research Fellow on this project and about to receive a master's degree in landscape architecture next week. Slide. Before we get further into the program, our research team would like to acknowledge that the research in this report occurred on the lands of the Pascua Yaqui and Tohono O'odham peoples, whose relationship with this land continues to this day. Some of the oldest known agricultural practices in the US have roots in the Tucson Basin and Southern Arizona. The people, culture, and history of this region allow us to live, build community, and grow food on this land today. As researchers at the University of Arizona, we acknowledge our individual and collective responsibility to address the ongoing legacies of dispossession and exclusion in the region, and we aim to cultivate a more just present and future. Our plan for our time today is simple. I will begin with a few reminders about Zoom etiquette, and then we will move into about 30 minutes of an overview of the main findings from the report. Next, we will hear from three panelists who are all practitioners in the local food system and who are among those interviewed for this report. Our three panelists are Audra Christoffel from the Community Food Bank of Southern Arizona, Amy Juan of the International Indian Treaty Council, and Cameron Jones from the Southern Arizona Young Farmers and Ranchers Coalition. Lastly, we will use the last 30 minutes or so to open to a question and answer session in which we look forward to hearing your comments and your questions. So a few reminders about Zoom etiquette. At this point, I'm sure most of the people on the call are experts. Please remember to keep yourself muted for the duration of the program. We invite you to submit your comments and questions in the chat feature as we move through the event, as we will have time to address some of these in the open Q&A session after the panelists speak. I'd like to let everyone know that this event is being recorded and will be loaded onto our center website following the event so that others can view it afterwards. And lastly, we would just like to ask everyone to please keep it civil. Today we'll be discussing issues that elicit strong feelings and responses, and we ask you to please help us to maintain a space of respect. Anyone violating these expectations for civil discourse will be muted and/or removed from the event. So the State of the Tucson Food System Report is the major publication of the Center for Regional Food Studies. Each edition documents the successes, challenges, and barriers to building a more resilient and equitable food system in the Sonora, Arizona borderlands. With this report, we seek to support the efforts of diverse social actors and institutions working for positive food system change in this region. This year's report has been a collaborative effort between the Center for Regional Food Studies and the Climate Assessment for the Southwest program. I'd like to take a moment now to just acknowledge the research team, as well as all of you who participated in this research through interviews and surveys. I see several of you that participated on this call, so thank you for being here. Although this year has been extremely challenging for all of us, for me personally, working with this research team and meeting with all of the different people working in the local food system has been very much a highlight, so thank you. As expressed in the title, this year's report is focused on assessing the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on our local food system in Southern Arizona. Gigi and I were in touch early on in the pandemic as we were both shocked by news headlines of panic buying and empty store shelves, COVID outbreaks at meat processing plants and in agricultural fields, mile-long lines of cars waiting to receive emergency food relief, and stories of people rediscovering food through gardening, cooking, or new subscriptions to local food boxes. By summer, we decided that it was important to use this year's report to understand how all of these shifts were playing out in Southern Arizona. So from August of 2020 until March of this year, our research team undertook a rapid qualitative assessment of the impacts of and responses to COVID-19 in our local food system. And those are the results that are now compiled in the report we are sharing with you today. As indicated on the map in front of you, we framed this study by focusing on the local food system in Pima County with a particular focus on Tucson. We also looked beyond the impacts of COVID-19 to begin to document other stressors, risks, and opportunities in our local food system. We consider this research as a launching point, not an endpoint. The next stages of this research will include focus groups, discussions about report findings, and explorations of other risks, be they economic, environmental, or societal, that are facing this region. And we intend to convene a working group of researchers and food system practitioners to continue these discussions and coordinate a strategic plan for our local food system that is situated within the constraints, needs, and opportunities of our region. I want to be clear on what this study is and is not. This study is a rapid snapshot of our local food system and how it has experienced and responded to COVID-19. I want to acknowledge that the crisis is very much ongoing, and with time, surely more stories will emerge and we will acquire an even deeper understanding of the long-term changes this crisis has produced in our region. The findings we share in the report are based on research gathered over the last year through interviews, surveys, and ongoing analysis of literature and policies. In total, we surveyed 19 food producers who sell some portion of their products to consumers within Pima County. We also interviewed 7 restaurant owners who use locally sourced ingredients in their business, 11 food distributors, including farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, food retailers, and emergency food relief organizations. And we also interviewed 19 food and agricultural organizations working in diverse areas of our food system throughout this region and the state. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Gigi Owen.
Thanks, Laurel. So I'm gonna start off, before we dive into some of our results, I want to situate our project in the local and global context of the past year. So in our report, we have this timeline that calls out some of the events that shaped local food system responses during the pandemic. We saw numerous and ever-shifting executive orders and declarations and mandates from federal, state, county, and local city governments. And these were around stay-at-home orders and wearing masks and distancing requirements. And each of these impacted daily operations of local food businesses and restaurants, as well as food distribution and access. We saw several types of COVID-related relief funds that were available federally or were funneled through state, city, or local organizations. And that caused a lot of extra maneuvering around accessing these funds. In terms of the pandemic itself, twice, Arizona registered the highest number of COVID infections in the world. That was once in July and once in January. In terms of social movements, we saw several demonstrations in support of Black lives throughout the year, to which there were a variety of local and state responses. And these events triggered deeper interrogation into racial inequities and systemic injustices, and understanding the disproportionate impacts of COVID experienced by different racial and ethnic groups. And these issues came up a lot in our interviews as things that need to be addressed locally if we want to build a more just and equitable food system. Finally, in terms of climate and weather, we also had a big year. We had the Bighorn Fire, which is the largest fire recorded in Pima County. We recorded the hottest summer temperatures in Tucson and the second hottest and second driest year on record in the state, all of which impacts local food production and distribution. So one of our goals in conducting this research was to look at the types of changes and adaptations that people were making in the midst of a crisis, and look to these lessons as we plan for and build a robust food system that can adapt to these time periods when we see economic, social, environmental, and political events converge. And one of our biggest takeaways is that local food systems play a crucial role during times of crisis. In Southern Arizona, local producers, distributors, and food and agricultural organizations quickly adjusted their operations to accommodate these ever-shifting conditions and to meet local food needs. In many cases, this was faster than the national supply chain could, especially in the early days of the pandemic-related shutdowns. When people saw empty store shelves, many turned to local sources. They turned directly to local farmers and ranchers, to local distributors, farmers markets, local subscription programs, as well as food banks, food pantries, and mutual aid collectives. These local sources were able to fill in those immediate gaps and increased food needs that occurred due to the pandemic impacts and shortages within conventional food systems. So in this ability to respond quickly, Southern Arizona's local food system also demonstrated several characteristics of resilience. Some of these characteristics included flexibility to maneuver changing circumstances and needs, having pre-established networks and partnerships, resource sharing across nodes of the food system, and open and direct communication channels. And something that we see in a lot of other climate adaptation work that's mirrored in these findings is that long-term relationships, trusted partnerships, and local knowledge that is grounded in the unique social, cultural, and environmental context of the region are the real building blocks of systems that are adaptable to various forms of risk. And we see evidence of this in evidence of this foundation in Southern Arizona. Of course, the local food system faced and continues to face many challenges. Although the local food system responded quickly to pandemic impacts, these shifts were costly in time, labor, energy, and money, especially because there wasn't a strategic crisis response plan already in place. Also, existing food system inequities became more apparent during the pandemic. The percentage of food insecure households in Arizona increased, and this was unevenly distributed across racial groups. So more Hispanic or Latinx and non-white households reported being food insecure than white households did. Lost or reduced employment during the pandemic also disproportionately impacted Hispanic, Latinx, and non-white communities. And this connects back to these instances of food insecurity. Also, in our interviews, people discussed several other challenges beyond the pandemic that present greater threats to the long-term stability and capacity of the local food system. These include increased heat and extreme drought, lack of access to affordable land and water resources, lack of support for new and small-scale farming and ranching operations, inadequate local infrastructure, such as processing facilities, cold storage, and transportation, and the need for skilled laborers and living wages for food system workers. Based on our research, we offer several recommendations in the report as starting points to expand system capacity, access to local food, and to prepare a collective and strategic response to future food-related crises. Our recommendations focus mostly on efforts and actions that will account for the unique arid environment of the Southwest, considering current and future limitations of land and water resources, considering demographic and population changes and development, and considering future climate projections. These plans and narratives should also aim to diversify participation, both in terms of who's shaping these narratives, policies, and practices in the local food system, as well as participation in terms of increasing local food access and affordability. Finally, these plans and actions should offer opportunities for sustained long-term investment in the local food system by incentivizing local food procurement by Southern Arizona institutions, businesses, and schools, and by seeking financial and policy support from county, state, and national sources. And on this point about planning, I want to mention that current efforts are underway to inform statewide food systems priorities. The Arizona Food Systems Network is developing a statewide food plan based on the knowledge and experiences across the state, and their planning process is open to any and all participants. As well, our research team hopes to continue our conversations with folks in Southern Arizona about our local food system, as Laurel had mentioned. So if you are interested in learning more or would like to get involved in these planning efforts, please do contact us for more information. And Laurel and I will put our emails in the chat. But for now, we're going to dive into some more of the impacts and responses that we saw in different food system sectors. And first up, Sean is going to talk about restaurants.
Thank you, Gigi. The restaurant sector is a key economic driver for the Tucson area and much of Arizona, making up about 10% of the local economy and jobs. Of the approximately 1,200 food-related businesses in the Tucson area, almost 2/3 are locally owned and operated, much higher than the national average. So any disruptions to the restaurant sector can have big impacts across the rest of the local food system. Before the start of the 2020 pandemic, there was a strong trend of moving towards a farm-to-table model. Now this trend has been slowed down as many restaurateurs have had to take a step back to reevaluate their business model. During this research process, we have had the opportunity to interview several restaurant owners, which has given us some insight into the impacts and responses that have been taken within this important sector of our local food system. Next slide, please. Many of the impacts to this industry due to the pandemic were economically related. Lost income stemming from many restaurants having to temporarily close their doors to the public has led some restaurants to cut as much as 75% of their staff, and most have had to reduce staff hours. From March of 2020 to March of 2021, 25 food-related businesses have had to permanently close their doors. And among those were several iconic local restaurants, including Cafe Poca Cosa, which had been in business for 36 years. Even with the dire economic situation faced by this industry, in the last year, there have been several new restaurants opening up, a sign that there is hope on the horizon. Another major impact to restaurants that reverberated through the food system was that of local distribution and production chain disruptions. With some of the farm-to-table restaurants in the area having to shut down, even temporarily, many of the local sourcing options have had to shift to other outlets, such as food banks or farmers markets. Once restaurants started to reopen again, it became difficult for them to reestablish local supplies, food supplies to the levels they once had before the pandemic. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of response, there was some funding provided from local governments to the Federal CARES Act, which included the loan program known as the Payment Protection Program, or PPP. Of those interviewed, many have noted that the process for the PPP loan was confusing, although it did help to offset costs for labor, rent, and utilities in the short term. Beyond funding programs, restaurant owners have had to be innovative, shifting their business models to include takeout and delivery services, which was especially difficult for traditionally dine-in-only restaurants. Other shifts included reducing menu sizes to specialize in unique items, and with the temporary changes in state and local regulations, the ability to offer grocery services. One example includes the shift of the owner of Cafe Botanica, serving local food as a restaurant, to opening up the Gallery Food Bodega, which specializes in offering local food in a grocery market format. Other responses included increasing online capacity by building online stores and offering cooking classes and wine tasting online, which have become such a big hit that they're foreseen to continue into the future. Now, these are just a few highlights from our findings, so please do check out the full report for additional information. Next, Eden will take you through some of the production, distribution, and other aspects of the report.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you all for joining us today. So as Laurel discussed, we conducted a survey with food producers in Southern Arizona who are growing food products for distribution and sale here in Pima County. So this included different types and sizes of agricultural operation, and they all experienced different impacts from the pandemic. And these impacts varied according to their marketing practices, to the resources they had available, and other factors. So you can learn more about the survey and the details of who responded and a bunch of other information in the report. For now, I just want to share a few of our findings. We found that 68% of the respondents were moderately to greatly impacted by the pandemic. And how they were impacted varied greatly, but here are some of the most often cited impacts, but they're certainly not limited to these. So producers reported a reduced ability to sell products, which impacted producers differently depending on their marketing practices, and it also fluctuated throughout the pandemic. So at the start of the pandemic, the status of farmers markets was uncertain, and when the farmers markets that were open, we're seeing much less foot traffic. And this led, of course, to reduced sales for some producers. For other producers who relied more on institutional accounts for sales, so that includes folks that are selling to schools and restaurants and other sorts of institutions, the closure of these institutions created major problems for selling their products. However, as the pandemic continued to unfold, demand for local food actually increased significantly, leading to increased sales at farmers market and some other direct-to-consumer channels. So this allowed producers to recuperate some earlier losses. Regardless of how they're selling their products, all producers had to adapt to new safety protocols around their work and their products. So tasks like packaging products for sale cost time and energy, and of course, reorienting one's entire marketing strategy also required significant energy and also risk. So how did producers respond? Producers had to shift market channels commonly, especially in cases where they relied on sales to schools and restaurants. So those who relied heavily on those kinds of sales took a much bigger hit and had to adapt more drastically. Some producers started CSA-style food box programs, started online sales, and also had folks coming out directly to their farm to pick up food. And in order to pivot to these new models effectively, they had to communicate with their customer base. So ability to communicate quickly with customers during these uncertain times was a key strategy to ensure continued sales. So online newsletters, social media, and just texting allowed producers to communicate changing product availability as well as where they'd actually be selling their products. And of course, having these communication channels established before the pandemic certainly helped to facilitate communication between producers and consumers. And then also we saw e-commerce or online commerce being a key avenue that helped farmers maintain sales. And 63% of our respondents created or expanded online marketing. A few other findings we wanted to highlight here. While farmers were eligible for relief funds from various sources, including the federal government, only 32% of our respondents actually accessed these funds. And those who did not access funds cited a lack of knowledge of the opportunities, a perceived lack of eligibility, or other barriers to applying as reasons why they didn't receive any funds. So these findings echo concerns voiced by the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition and others that these agricultural relief funds, particularly at the federal level, were designed with larger corporate farms in mind, and that created certain barriers for small farmers, diversified farmers, and historically underrepresented and underserved farmers. So issues accessing relief funds should certainly be a cause for concern among small farmers and also historically underrepresented farmers as environmental and economic disruptions in agriculture become more frequent in the coming years. We also asked farmers to rate how concerned they were about the impacts of the pandemic versus how concerned they were about a number of other environmental and economic stressors. And we had 3 of those stressors that were ranked as higher, a larger concern than the pandemic. So heat waves, drought, and seasonal temperature changes were ranked as more concerning than the impacts of the pandemic. And we want to highlight this here because these environmental issues put serious constraints on agriculture in this region, and they also have compounding effects. So for example, this year was one of the hottest and driest on record, and this weather added to the impacts of the pandemic and increased risk for farmers. So these are some of the highlights from our engagements with producers. There's a lot more in the report, so do check that out if you're interested. And we're also going to be interviewing farmers. This is all based on a survey, but we're going to be interviewing farmers to get a fuller picture of their experiences during COVID this summer. Next, we conducted interviews with food distributors, including farmers markets, CSAs, and other organizations distributing food, including mutual aid groups, reduced cost and free food distribution services like food banks and discounted produce programs. These food distributors faced major challenges during the pandemic. One of the biggest impacts was the closure of schools, restaurants, and other food serving institutions, which caused all kinds of supply chain issues here at the local level, but also at the national and global scales. And locally, we can look at the example of Pivot Produce. Pivot is a distributor that connects local producers to restaurants. And when restaurants suddenly closed, Pivot lost 90% of its orders practically overnight. So at the same time that these market channels were closing down, consumer demand was rapidly increasing through other channels. So for example, a local CSA saw major increases in subscriptions, while distributors like Market on the Move saw record numbers of customers coming through for discounted produce. And also the need for low and no cost food also increased as folks were experiencing new and persistent forms of food insecurity. So distributors had to change their models to operate in these new conditions and these constantly changing conditions. So I mentioned how Pivot was impacted by the closure of restaurants. They had to take a week off buying produce from farmers, and then they shifted really rapidly to a food box delivery model. So these, they posted a single Instagram post advertising this new service, and the shares sold out overnight and had to be capped because there was that much demand. Pivot also created an e-commerce site where other businesses can sell their food products. So Pivot is an example of a business that totally changed their model. Adaptations in other organizations were a bit less drastic, but still significant. So for example, the Santa Cruz Farmers Market shifted to a drive-through farmers market, which required extra time and labor to operate. Food distributors also work to distribute low and no cost food through subsidized CSA boxes, free food delivery, and donations to mutual aid groups. Distributors also formed partnerships to reach particularly vulnerable populations. So for example, Pivot Produce teamed up with a community food bank to deliver fresh produce to seniors, and teamed up with other local groups to reach other populations in need. And then we also saw the emergence of mutual aid projects like Tucson Food Share and the South Tucson Community Outreach, which emerged to really fill a big gap in food distribution. And both of these entities work through donations and volunteers to share food with others. So they're really based on neighbors helping neighbors and just addressing community need. And something really crucial about these groups is that they don't collect any personal information. They're not concerned about who needs food or why they need food. So folks who are uncomfortable providing that personal information, for example, undocumented folks or folks who don't feel comfortable giving that information, were able to access food, no questions asked. So those were really important collectives that emerged during this time. And then we also learned a ton from local food and agriculture organizations. And we can't get into much detail here, but by reading the institutions section of our report, you can learn about the roles played by these institutions, including the roles as advocates, policy actors, resource sharers, communicators, and conveners. The report also describes impacts and responses to the pandemic on food and agriculture on the Tohono O'odham Nation. So on the Tohono O'odham Nation, food access and food security has been and continues to be a major issue, given that there's only one grocery store in an area the size of Connecticut. So as the pandemic wore on, folks from outside came onto the nation to buy food at this store, leading to food shortages beyond the food shortages that all grocery stores were facing. Low-income folks also had limited access due to the timing of when food assistance becomes available during the month in relation to when food is available at the store. And then also, as a staff member of AHO Center for Sustainable Agriculture noted, while farmers markets in Tucson and other cities were booming, there was no real increased demand for local food on the nation. And this is because local food is often already out of reach for Indigenous people due to its high cost. So an important difference to note there is that local food demand may have been booming in Tucson, but it wasn't so on the Tohono O'odham Nation. During the pandemic, AHO CSA, San Javier Co-op Farm, and other organizations worked to distribute food across the nation in the form of food boxes and hot meals. And the International Indian Treaty Council provided support for San Javier Co-op Farm to distribute meals. And then aside from these immediate and acute impacts of the pandemic, this year has also given renewed urgency to community conversations about O'odham food production and control over seeds. So it's amplified the need to continue working to train a next generation of O'odham farmers, and also the need to address the ways that O'odham and other Indigenous communities are often left out of conversations about our food system here in Southern Arizona. So I encourage you to read the section of the report to learn more about O'odham food and agriculture and some of these issues. And hopefully we'll be joined by Amy Wan today, one of our panelists who can elaborate on this. And then finally, we'd like to share a few other key findings of the report regarding ongoing opportunities and challenges in the Southern Arizona food system. So during COVID-19, overall, we saw a significant increase in interest in and demand for local food. Yet this time also raised questions about our local food system's capacity to meet that demand, either in a crisis situation or if going into the future, if that demand is sustained. So this question of capacity is pretty complex, and it's linked to a lot of other issues in our food system that Gigi gestured toward earlier, including issues of land access, agricultural workforce development, climate and water, and ongoing forms of inequity and food insecurity. So in order to address these issues, we need system-wide strategic investments in food and agriculture. And to learn more about these challenges and how they turn up here in Southern Arizona specifically, you can read the Looking Ahead section of the report, which elaborates them in some detail. And I also encourage you all to check out the policies and projects section. And this is a place where we present ongoing efforts going on right now in Southern Arizona to address these challenges and barriers. And there's also some ways that you can get involved in advocating for policy or joining groups and things like that. So for now, I'm going to hand it over to Gigi and to our panelists who will be sharing their insights about the impact of COVID on our food system.
Thanks, Eden, and thanks to the rest of the team. I just want to, I think, yeah, Sean just put in the chat, there's a link in there where you can download the report. Also, you know, if you have any way that you want to get involved or have questions, please feel free to contact Laurel and I. Our emails are there, or they're also in the chat. Next, I'm so pleased that we have 3 representatives of the local food system here with us today. They're going to talk about their various roles and just talk about some of the impacts and responses that they saw in their own work and the communities that they work with, and also hear about their visions for their future and what needs to happen to make these visions a reality. I'll briefly introduce them here, and then I'll let them introduce themselves more fully themselves. We're going to hear from Audra Christoffel, who's the co-director of partnerships and community impact at the Community Food Bank of Southern Arizona. We'll hear from Amy Wan, who works with the International Indian Treaty Council. And we'll also hear from Cameron Jones, who's involved in various food system efforts with the Southern Arizona Young Farmers and Ranchers Coalition. Audra, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. I was having some connectivity issues earlier, so please let me know if my video works or does not work, and I can turn myself off if necessary. So it's so nice to be here. Like Gigi mentioned, I work for the Community Food Bank, and I feel like I am in a space with like cherished friends and colleagues. So many of you, I know and work with so much. So I'm so happy to be here with y'all and hope to hear some of what you all have to share as well. In my current role, like Gigi mentioned, I am co-director of partnerships and community impact at the food bank. And, for 40 some years, we've been working to kind of meet folks' immediate food needs in the Tucson and broader Southern Arizona community. And I think, more and more all the time are really just leaning into also working really hard on addressing these like systems and root causes of poverty and hunger as well, and like really holding those two hand in hand as really important and needing to be tackled together. So I worked for the food bank for about 12 years, and during most of that time have really spent a lot of my time working on food systems issues, working closely with farmers and other food system partners. Really, I think our role as the community food bank has often been kind of identifying the gaps that exist in like the current food system and convening folks around how do we address things as needed where they are right now. So some of that has looked like ongoing kind of targeted access to food issues and economic opportunities including the Abundant Harvest Cooperative, which is a shared table and cooperative for small and startup food producers who can sell through a shared table at market, and also kind of collectively and cooperatively build their skills and also like identify needs and come together around how to continue to build out a food system that is working for everyone. Supporting the Santa Cruz River Farmers Market. And then for a lot of folks on this call have worked closely over the last 6 or so years to sort of build out this farm to institution value chain. After hearing from farmers for a long time that farmers markets and direct consumer markets are great, but really we need these more targeted investments in how to get food into bigger institutions and create new market channels that serve both folks who need and want to eat in our community, so everyone, and also really values the work and labor of farmers and food producers in our community. And so some of the key partners in that work are on the call: Ronnie and Stacy from TUSD, Pivot Produce, Eric, Cameron from Southern Arizona Young Farmers and Ranchers Coalition, John from Forever Young Farm. So definitely representing here. And I think, in reflecting on this last year, some of the adaptations and the quick transitions that happened in our food system, I think were really built on the fact that we have so many of these existing relationships, and also so many like neighborhood-based and place-based grassroots organizations that just really know and understand like what communities need. And so listening to those folks as well. And then some of maybe just another key component that's shifted over the last year is we have always given some funding to our partners, and historically that's been a lot of our hunger relief partners for funding around infrastructure and things like that. And this last year, we were able to really look at our practices of how we're being good stewards of the resources that we're given as this kind of anchor institution in the community that's receiving some state and local funding. And so we're able to give just under $3 million of grants this last year to many different types of organizations doing all kinds of really amazing work in the food system, in their communities, mutual aid groups, farmer cooperatives, et cetera. And so that's another sort of like key piece of the work that we're doing. I don't want to talk too long, so I'll pass it on.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, my alarm's going off. Next, I think I saw Amy Wan join. Yes, great. Hi.
Hello.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Skukdash, Anya Jigik Amy Wan. I am from the Tohono Nation, and I am first and foremost a community member. I was born and raised on the nation. So I'm really excited to share, what we've been experiencing and what our vision is for the future with our deep roots here in the Tohono, in the desert. And so my past history is working with organizations such as Tohono Community Action, doing a lot of youth development and leadership programming, because, first of all, we felt we needed to reach out to young people to encourage them to do this work, especially to do farming, something that's really labor intensive. So our job was basically to make farming and himaduk, which is culture, make it cool. And we were very successful with that, and had many programs come out of that, such as the youth program, which is Young Autumn United Through Health, and Project Oiduk, which I can share a little bit more about later. I've also have experience working with Santa Vera Co-op Farm. And then currently I work with the International Indian Treaty Council, which is an Indigenous people's human rights organization that is basically has its roots in the American Indian movement and so on and so forth, and has been around since 1974. Our time here in Tucson which is now the home of our home base office here on 6th and Ajo. We've been here for 3 years. So our work for the past 3 years has been building partnerships and familiarizing ourselves with the different organizations, and also vice versa, to let people know who we are and what our work is and how we like to continue moving forward. So I'm really glad to be here and excited, and thank you for the invitation to participate and to hear the voices of the Octum community. So it's helpful. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for joining us too. And now I'll pass it over to Cameron.
Hello, everybody. Sorry, there's some noise out of my window, but my name is Cameron Jones. I'm a member of the Southern Arizona Young Farmer and Rancher Coalition. And I grew up in Tucson, but I'm not from an agricultural family. And so at one point I had to start, once I knew that that's what I kind of wanted to move in that direction, I had to navigate the unclear path for how one goes into farming. And that took me to North Carolina back, farmed around Southern Arizona. Luckily, I've been able to connect with mentor farms and farmers. And so now through the work with the Southern Arizona Young Farmer and Rancher Coalition, we're trying to figure out how to streamline that process for people coming up behind. So young people who've had experience in school gardens or community gardens can pursue that interest, pursue that passion without having to do a bunch of 2 steps forward, 1 steps back, go around in circles. And then also through Southern Arizona Young Farmer Rancher Coalition, we want people who are farming to be supported, because in addition to needing more people farming, we need the people who are currently farming to be able to continue. And that's economic, that's social, that's emotional. So we try to make a space where people can, share resources, share common challenges, commiserate, and then strategize to, make lighten the load a little bit. So I'm sort of with other people who are not established farmers and are still trying to figure out how to take that step from being an apprentice or being trained on other people's farms to managing or owning or whatever our own farm. We feel like we're working with other people to try to build a bridge that we need to cross because we need to get to the other side. And then also, hopefully then that means the people coming behind us will just be able to benefit from that groundwork. And so I'm still in the middle of trying to figure out how it is that one gets a farm off the ground and gets going. And so I appreciate all of the work that everyone's doing to help all those different pieces fit together. And I think COVID in this past year, it really just confirmed that all of the things we thought and all the things that were issues before about farmland loss and aging farmers and the need for more farm workers and more equity in the food system and in our society just really hit home in all of those pieces. And so I'm excited that maybe that will get us to coalesce around some real tangible things. So that way we're more prepared for challenges that may come in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Cameron. That's a really great jumping off point into our next panel question, which is basically just if you all could speak a little bit more about some of your experiences around COVID, either in the work that you do or with the communities that you work with. And I guess we'll just keep going in the same order. But Audrey, you'd like to go first?
I can.
Oh no, I think I muted you. I'm sorry. I meant to spot you.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. I think there's so many things to talk about. Like I'll try to keep it short here. Like you all mentioned from your report, I think we really just saw on full display the way COVID just really laid bare the disparities that already exist. where Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women are being disproportionately bearing the brunt of these like economic and health challenges. In terms of specific things that we saw in community, like we definitely in the shift of all of our distributions to a drive-through model, we saw initially this like really big increased need, which I think was pretty similar across the United States, right? A lot of folks coming in, less food security than ever. And then really interestingly, as folks were finally getting signed up for that extra unemployment and those benefits, the need actually decreased. We saw less people coming in. And I think that's just important to highlight because it really shows when people have that financial flexibility, they don't need emergency food services or they're like seeking them somewhere else. And maybe on a positive note, you know, this disruption in the national food supply chain, like you all mentioned also, we just really saw a renewed and broad interest in food production and local food purchasing at a level that I had never seen before. So I know, you know, our farm and garden team just saw a massive increase in folks' interest in food production, in seeds, in getting chicks to raise. The Las Milpitas farm filled up. All the plots have been full. So a really big interest in family level food production. And then I think we also saw other smaller startup food producers scaling up and looking for additional outlets for their food as, you know, their other jobs, whether that was in restaurants or other sectors, were less secure. And in a partner survey that we did in June of 2020, we saw just overwhelmingly from all types of the partners that we have that everybody was in need, had an increase in financial need. And 100% of the farm partners that we surveyed reported a decrease in revenue. So obviously really similar to what your findings were. And just a lot of that uncertainty. And I think the other key piece that we saw really was a majority of all of our partners specifically stated that they want to partner across sectors with other organizations to purposely increase resiliency. So there's this, I think, this deep understanding that individual organizations or individual like sectors cannot tackle these challenges alone. We have to find ways to be working across this really complex set of problems in deep collaboration. I already mentioned our partner grants, but I think as an organization, the food bank also has, I think, been really really thinking about how important it is to continue our investment in our network of partners, and those being a vast array of different types of partners, and how, you know, when we've centralized you know, food distribution or hunger relief, it's actually like not serving the best interests of community. So we're really looking at what are the ways that we can redistribute resources via grants, via, you know, this other funding that's coming in to these more neighborhood-based organizations who know what folks, they know what's needed, right? Mutual aid groups who, like you all mentioned, are really meeting a need of folks in a different way that's less restricted, I think, and can serve folks in a way that works better for them oftentimes. Yeah, and I think just this, again, this set of partnerships and relationships within the food system set us up for being able to be more flexible and, you know, shifting things. Like I know, obviously, when schools closed, those contracts and those partnerships that we have between farmers and schools needed to be kind of reconfigured. So it was a matter of like, okay, how can we continue to meet this need? Can some of that be rerouted into farmers markets? Can some of that be rerouted to Pivot? Because Pivot's seeing this increased demand for CSA, direct to consumer sort of sales. And then really looking also internally at our own, like that, how we live out our own values, right? So kind of taking a look at what are the ways that we can redirect some organizational resources to purchase a percentage of food locally for the hunger relief work that we do, and really diving in, I think, to the ways in which we as an organization participate in exploitative systems, right? And looking at how to be better advocates for fair trade, wage justice within the food system, et cetera. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Audra. It's yeah, it really. I mean, I appreciate all of your comments, and especially, that touching on the partnerships. I mean, I think that is just one of the findings that came out so strongly in all the interviews of like, that is really what allowed people to keep going. Next, Amy, would you like to talk about how COVID kind of impacted you and the work you do?
Yes. Well, first I like to start off with the little background to give everybody an idea of what the food situation's like in O'odham communities. One is, recognizing that we traditionally have been farmers, especially along different waterways like the Santa Cruz, controlling waters through auction methods, which is flood farming. And have had that in our history, but because of different events in history and just different things that have impacted our communities, I would say about 10 years ago we found ourselves in a place where we realized that there weren't any farmers, and there were very few, and they were elderly. And so one of our main guys, Clifford Pablo, who's also the agricultural instructor at O'odham Community College, at that time, he came to us who were starting work at TOCA and basically said, we need to grow new farmers. And so that was part of our mission at the time. And what some of the information he gave us that really lit our fire was, to think about in terms of timelines of food and our food production. In the 1920s, O'odham were farming about 1 million pounds of terpene beans. But by the early 2000s, we were only farming about 100 pounds or so. And so to really, think about that as young people, as a community, to think about all the different reasons why we were in this situation, it really lit, like I said, lit the fire for growing new farmers. And so there we developed a lot of internship programs where we took young people and basically just got to work the way that our grandparents did, learning how to farm, from flood farming to irrigated farming, doing school gardens, doing community gardens, and also starting up farmers markets, which is also, that's also, I guess, like a modern twist on how we used to share our resources and share our food. Because, in the past, everything that we grew and everything that we gathered and hunted was shared within our communities. And so seeing all of that growth within the past 10 years, it really taught me how much of an investment in time and energy and resources is needed to really revitalize a generation and revitalize our food systems on the O'odham Nation. And so, but still a lot of work to do, because if you're unaware, the O'odham Nation is 2.8 million acres. It's about the size of the state of Connecticut, but we only have one grocery store. We only have one grocery store in Sells. And, that's where you can find your veggies, your household items, and, what have you. There are a few convenience stores and small stores in different communities, but it doesn't, they don't have everything that we need, especially fresh food. So that's the situation. And so when COVID came, and we're also talking about, our community has different levels of economic security. A lot of our elders still live at home and still live with their families, and they depend a lot of times on their Social Security checks and what have you. Also families who get food assistance also are on a schedule. And so you are talking about a community that is existing or surviving on different timelines each month. So when COVID hit, it was really hard to see the impacts that it had, you know, firsthand, that there was a need because the hoarding started, you know, and if it's only one grocery store on the nation, and also like the delivery of food and goods, you know, it's still on a schedule, and so the shelves are empty, you know, and that was something that I had never seen in my lifetime. And so that brings people here to Tucson, which a lot of people usually do grocery shop in Tucson because it's cheaper, because of the transportation cost of transporting food to bashes there. That's also an added cost. So for instance, like a bag of grapes could be $8, you know. So that added cost of traveling to get food, and then also competing, and you know, the health scares and trying to be safe, also had an impact on the people. And another thing that was pretty interesting was seeing non-tribal members from surrounding communities come to bashes to also try to get as much food as they could. So there was also another, you know, there was also another, I guess, set of competition for food that we had never really experienced before. And, you know, how do you deal with that? You know, you can't deny someone food, you know, to live. And so that was pretty difficult to see and experience. But when, I guess, what was really beautiful at the same time was seeing when the people started to move. So for example, in the San Javier community, which is not too far from us, a lot of the young adults, my friends, started to organize and started to, you know, provide that mutual aid support, or just, you know, I guess in Autumn we would say, that, you know, to work together and to provide, especially for, like I said, a lot of elders and a lot of families who, you know, were just trying to stay safe by sheltering in place, you know, at home. So I was really inspired by that community, because they went as far as butchering cattle to provide meat to the community, doing that at the feast house. And so it was really, like I said, beautiful to see this community come together. The cowboys, you know, a lot of them do own cattle. And so when there was scares of like meat shortages and things like that, they butchered whole cows and divided that amongst the families in the community, as well as making judgment with our tortillas, making sure that elderly, especially in families, had that each week. So there were gatherings like that, and also bringing resources from the outside, such as food and, you know, supplies. That was really awesome to see. And that's on the east side of the nation. On the west end of the nation, more towards Ajo, we had Ajo CSA, who really shifted into gear to provide mutual aid, working with places like the food bank and other resources in Phoenix and Glendale, other farmers that they had connections with, to bring fresh produce and bring fresh food and other types of food to the Thon-Out Nation that was being distributed on the west end. And of course, with the Thon-Out Nation as a government, within itself, starting to provide that support as well. So each district, the Thon-Out Nation is made up of 11 districts. And so what continued to happen was that each district began to organize within themselves with the overall umbrella of the Thon-Out Nation, bringing in food, bringing in supplies, and beginning to distribute that way by each district to each of the communities within those districts. So it really was a you know, big move of our communities to really really kick into gear. You know, what does it mean to take care of a community? What do we need to do? What do we need to provide? And also taking a second look at, okay, what kind of food are we distributing to our communities? A lot of times, you know, it's processed food, it's boxed food and things like that that were coming in as donations, which is good, you know, it helps people survive and get through hard times. But what do we do when that runs out? That's not really self-sufficient, you know, and we pride ourselves on being able to be self-sufficient. Like I shared in the beginning, you know, in the 1920s, we were growing millions of pounds of tepary beans, which, you know, are also great within ourselves for nutrition, for resilience, and also because they're drought tolerant. And so thinking about those things kickstarted the second phase of movement in our community, which was to revitalize and to strengthen the growth of traditional foods, especially because, you know, it takes because our foods are adapted to our area, you know, require very little water. We can't talk about our traditional foods without talking about our language, without talking about our culture, without our ceremonies and things like that. And so it was just really, you know, unfortunately or fortunately, it really kickstarted a lot of good things as well, especially that culture of helping each other, of providing for each other. And I think especially for young people, to be reminded what our role is in the community to help protect our elders and our families and our children. So right now, through another example of what we have been able to do within the organization I work with now, is being able to acquire the support, especially monetary support, like Audra had mentioned, from some organizations like the Food Bank, like the Southern Arizona Community Foundation, who provided grants that enabled us to create partnerships with the San Javier Co-op Farm and the Yomempequia Foundation in the Pascua Yaqui tribe. And so we created an alliance to provide these resources to the community. At San Javier Co-op Farm, they were able to provide free meals through that funding to the community, free cooked meals. There were one every week of traditional foods, especially, and also seeds and some things like fruit trees, just to provide, you know, those resources. And they themselves kicked into gear too, planting extra food that they knew that they would be able to give away or to, you know, provide for projects such as the free meal giveaway. And then also with the Yomempequia Foundation, or in the Pascua Yaqui community, they're also in a renaissance of growing food again. And so to be able to provide education and resources for them to engage young people in creating community gardens, that's still ongoing. This partnership is still ongoing. And so our conversations now are, you know, what are our next steps? And I'm really proud of us. I'm really proud of all of us for coming together in the way that we have been, especially forming stronger relationships and alliances with each other, because at the end of the day, we all need to eat. No matter where we come from, no matter what background or class, we all need to eat. And so, you know, how can we continue to work together and provide what it is that our communities need, whether it's food or support or education. All those things are needed across the board. And overall, with IATC, the work that we do is international. So we are connected with Indigenous peoples all over the world. And so that was also inspiring to think about and to talk about with people who are fish people, people who are buffalo people, wild rice people, taro root people, tepary bean people, for all of us to talk about how we were experiencing these food changes in our community, how we could strengthen those things through our cultures, but also to talk about, the knowledge that we have that has been passed down and how to pay attention to that and how do we prepare for those changes that are coming in the future, such as drought, sharing seeds with people in India and people all over the world, especially with tepri beans. We recognize that as autumn, those beans, the bao, are very special and that they can help feed a lot of people. And so, that's where things are at, and I'm happy to expand on some of the topics as we continue having a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for all the background and insight. And, I think moving on to Cameron, I know it's one thing that you had mentioned, Amy, was, this idea of growing new farmers. And I know that that's a big topic that Cameron is a part of. And so actually, I'm going to ask if we can move on to kind of thinking about what our visions for a more resilient and equitable local food system in Southern Arizona might look like, and what things are needed to make that happen. So Cameron, I will turn that over to you.
Cool, thank you. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Ajay. Before we transition to like the vision, which I think each of us holds pieces of, it was nice to hear a little bit, and I look forward to reading more in the report about how different communities and different people responded within their spheres of influence, because I remember, I'm thinking back now to March, like it was crazy. And I think people really had to, am I cutting out?
Your voice is good, but your video is a little sticky.
Okay, yeah. But how everyone had to respond sort of with short-term crisis, like not sure what's coming and trying to do whatever we could. And I think that's, still ongoing somewhat, but I think looking ahead, it would be really great to, learn from the experiences different people had and have a like proactive vision moving ahead, because some of the things that people talked about, like we know we need more food and it needs to be accessible to people economically. And so that's like a piece of it, right? We know we need more farmers, and for farmers to be able to stay in business and make a living and make the investments they need to improve their operations. And so we know that these different things in distribution is a challenge, and in different communities having equal access to the food that's grown in our region is something maybe historically that it hasn't been true. And so I think, I'd be curious to see or find out that like how things like the State of the Tucson Food System report and those kind of things can also be a place where we, take the experiences we have from the COVID-19 experience, like the historical knowledge we have, the long-standing trends, which similar to what Amy talked about, it's true in like on the Tohono Nation with farmers getting older and there being not as many young people, or there being a gap between the farmers who are aging out of their working career and people trying to get into it, and how we match those two things up to get the training they need and give them the opportunity on land. Like how those different pieces that we know need to be done can be sort of like identified clearly, and then all the different resources that responded in all these great ways, like at a moment's notice, can be marshaled like more intentionally and strategically and proactively to do some of these things that we know need to be done, to reverse these trends of farmers aging out, of farmland being developed for housing, for water being increasingly unreliable or inaccessible or insecure. And so I think, moving ahead, I think it would be really interesting to really identify a vision, like a collective vision for what we need, and put some pieces in place, partially informed by what people are already doing and in other states or other countries. So that way we really start marching. And I would hope that maybe this like State of a Tucson food system report could also then, hold ourselves accountable to progress, and we'd be able to see like year after year, like, okay, there are more farmers, or there are more opportunities for people that are getting into farming to get the training that they need. And that there are more reliable markets at price points that make sense for the cost of production for all of the farmers in the food system currently. And, I think I know from conversations with Eric and others, like, at the height of it, when Pivot Produce was redistributing a ton of food, they were purchasing a lot of food from Phoenix, or from Mexico. Because even though Eric, purchases food from Southern Arizona growers first. So I think all of that is just indicative of there's a huge gap between the supply and the demand, and there's a ton of complications around land, equity, access to capital, access to credit, for there to be more people growing food in our region. And these are all not unique to us, but they're the problems that we need to solve here, because especially if you're talking about national or large farms elsewhere that sell nationally and internationally, they don't have any loyalty or connections to our community in Southern Arizona. So, when push comes to shove, it's going to go to the highest bidder somewhere. And a lot of what I heard today was talking about relationships and mutual aid and helping one another. And I think that only happens when you know one another. And so expecting that people elsewhere are going to look out for us when times get tough feels like wishful thinking. And I would rather we proactively reduce the reliance on that. Of course, it's never going to maybe be, it's never going to be 100%, but certainly we can make more progress than we do now, where we're having to source a lot of, even for our local or regional distributors, it's coming from outside of our immediate region. And so I think, yeah, a place where people can go from their experience at community gardens and school gardens to being apprentices on existing farms, to working on incubator farms as they work out their businesses, to then having access to farmland to grow as they grow as farmers in their skills, and as their the demand for what they grow increases, that they can grow with it. Onboarding other people in a cooperative model, like that would be my hope, is that we really have a pipeline of like young kids, because it's such a small percentage of people that are farming, and we can't afford to have people that would want to farm not see an opportunity. So we need to really have the opportunities, knowing that, out of 10 kids that maybe see it, one sticks with it, just because of the million other complications in life. And so really putting the pieces in place so that way there is a pathway for those that want to follow it. So that way we can reverse some of these trends 10, 15 years down the line. We're not lamenting that not only are there no young farmers, but there's not even any old farmers to teach the young farmers, even if there were young farmers who wanted to learn. So that's sort of like the piece that I think we're working on it and trying to keep a clear vision of, is just pathways into the field for people who want to pursue agriculture.
Yeah, I think that's we can't have a local food system if we don't have local food being grown here. I do, of course, we went over time, but there's about 12 minutes left. And so I do want to, if participants on the call want to have questions for our panelists or about the report, I know a few have come in through chat. Laurel, I don't know if there's any that you want to call out in particular. If you are participating and you'd like to say something, you can use the raise hand button and it'll kind of put you to the front and I can unmute you. So I'll just give a second in case anyone has questions. Otherwise, we'll just continue the conversation. Yes, okay. Christine Jensen, please, you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
My question is, do we realistically have enough water in the Tucson area to actually support a really vibrant and far-reaching food supply?
Yes, that is, as someone mentioned in an interview, the elephant in the room. And so I think that, you know, thinking about how we work with kind of building the food system that we have given these constraints is something that's going to take ingenuity and technology and trying out various, you know, climate adapted techniques that maybe don't use as much water. And I think that, you know, in some cases, Arizona could be a real test bed for how to grow crops in an arid climate in ways that are sustainable and, you know, nourish the populations there. So yes, I think that that's, you know, something that came up in most all of our interviews. And I think that it's something that we need to be really conscious of moving forward. I think that there's been a lot of growth in terms of water saving agricultural techniques. And I think that those can be expanded upon, but also, you know, that those kinds of technologies become economically feasible for small scale farmers as well. And I think some of those are just more adapted to these larger scale operations that I think that there needs to be ways to, like, you know, scale that down and maybe look at, you know, resource sharing or infrastructure sharing that allows some of those costs of some of those water saving techniques to be used on a small scale. Anyone else have input on that? Amy, yes.
One of the things we like to say is, you know, how can we use our wisdom from the past to create solutions for the future? And I think there's a lot of things that we could say, but I also would like to, you know, just point out that, you know, while we're trying to figure out how to manage our water to survive, I think we need to look at the overall, you know, just network of what's happening in our community, because Tucson has such a big focus on mining right now, and mining takes so much water. So to me, it's like a question of, well, I mean, there's so many directions that we could go, you know, in with that, because, you know, some people argue, well, we need the copper for our technology and things like that. But there's so many mining projects happening now that I think a lot of, like, just community members are unaware of. But that also takes a lot of water and just, you know, development in general. But I am happy, like you said, there's a wave of water saving techniques and rainwater harvesting that people are learning to utilize. So I think that our best bet is to continue in that way, and to continue looking at other communities and ways, even if it's on the other side of the world, you know, like we're all on this earth there, and we need to figure it out together, someone said. But rainwater harvesting is a big thing of ours. Also, you know, what does rain look like? We all know that last summer was very, very hard for all of the farmers with very little rain. So what do we do in that case? And so I don't have all the answers, but I do feel that we together can come up with an answer or answers. But really taking a look at what other pieces of the puzzle there are that need our attention in order to survive.
Yes, thank you. Any other audience questions?
So a while, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, that was me.
Oh, okay. A while back, I believe it was Christina was asking, what have you learned during this time that was implemented in your work that would help push forward your missions? And I wonder if maybe, I think Cameron spoke to that a little bit, but maybe Audra and Amy have thoughts as well on that question. You're muted.
Do you want to go, Amy, or should I?
You can go. Can someone repeat the question or write it in the chat so I can
Sure. The
think
question,
about it? You can go, Audra. Thank you.
what have you learned during this time that was implemented in your work that would help push forward your missions?
I think the biggest thing that comes to mind right away is just how much we think things are like unchangeable in a moment, right? Like I think about that in our, you know, even like at the food bank, like we think all these things are like not changeable, but then we go through this like incredible crisis moment. And I think it's given us a real sense of like, actually, we don't have to do things this way. Just because we've been doing things some way, it doesn't mean that that's how we have to continue. And so to me, that's like the biggest, deepest, most impactful learning in this moment for me is just we always have the opportunity to say like we don't want to do things this way anymore. We want to learn, we want to change, we want to listen better, we want to restructure, we want to put people at the center, and I feel like that should continue, and I hope it does.
I can go next. What I've learned is how reliant we have been on these systems, but also how resilient we are and how strong we are when we come together, you know, whether that's in our own families, whether that's in our own neighborhoods or communities or nations, that it is possible to take care of each other and to provide for each other without these systems that we have become dependent on. And so I totally agree with Audra, you know, how can we continue to move in that direction with that same mindset? Because, you know, I don't think we can continue to survive at the pace and in the way that we have been pre-pandemic. And so it was like a blessing in disguise, you know, some might say, to really wake us up and to really think about the changes that we need to make in the future. And also for our kids, you know, with the work that we've done in the community over the past years with TOCA, we used to play scenarios with high school students and say, hey, if something happened tomorrow and you needed to find food and water, what would you do? And I always remember one student said, well, I'll go basically loot bashes. And we're like, well, that's our only grocery store. And a lot of the food comes from the outside. So what happens when we run out of that? And then it turned into conversations of, you know, well, what foods can we eat? You know, there's the saguaro fruit, the cholla buds, you know, and so on and so forth. So now the young people see we weren't playing, we weren't kidding, that knowledge is needed and it's important for you to know. So yeah, that was a big learning lesson, I think, for everybody, but especially this new generation, and for them to see us in action was so good for them to see as well. So that's what I learned.
Laura, were there other questions that you saw in the chat?
Well, actually, Christina had another question about the kind of impacted supply chains during COVID, and to what extent that impact was positive or negative. And I wonder, seems like a good question for Audra, maybe. I don't know if you could speak to how supply chains impacts affected the way the food bank operated, and kind of your take on how that has played out.
Yes, I can do my best. I'm probably not the best person at the food bank to speak to this, but I know, you know, like this kind of ties into what I mentioned before in terms of like continued organizational learning. And I think also just like a real deep and critical look at the ways that we are that we are part of current systems and perpetuating current systems. And so I know, obviously most of the time we're just getting tons and tons of food from across the border in Mexico. And I think historically with really like a real disconnect from what does that mean for the communities where that food is grown? What does that mean for the people who are growing that food? What are the labor practices, et cetera? So that's a little bit of like, not exactly to this question, but I think even in this like disruption, it's been helping us to clarify like how do we actually want to be in partnership with communities across our region, not even just within this state, but across states, across countries, and how do we find new and different ways to partner in ways that are life-giving, and again, like I think people-centric and earth-centric, and maybe that means importing less food. Maybe that means, I think for us, like shifting some of our dollars explicitly to purchase local food, even though it's more expensive. And just like, I think just holding that space of how can we do things differently? Like, even if we can't change it all at once, to commit to that like critical look at, how, even to this question, like everything is connected, right? It's hard to when you start pulling the strings and just there's a lot.
Thank you. So I just want to say thank you again to everyone. We are at 3 p.m. And I know that there's a few more questions. I'm happy to stay on with our panelists, with other people who have questions for a little bit, as long as our panelists are. But I do want to not hold people to much past 3 p.m. on a Friday. So I know I see there's some chat questions. Maybe, gosh, sorry, okay. Amy has to leave. Amy, would you like to give some parting words?
Yes, my apologies. I have to leave. It's Friday, but it's still a busy day. I just want to say thank you to the communities, to the farmers, to especially the young people out on the Donald Nation who moved quickly. Even more quickly than the tribal government, really, honestly. But it's because of those connections, knowing our community, just like was said earlier, we can't continue to work together or help each other if we don't know each other. So I really want to emphasize that it's so important to nurture our relationships and our connections, so that, when and as things continue to happen, that we know who to turn to, and we know what our roles are, we know what our strengths are, and we also know what our weaknesses are, or where we can, be of most help. And so just thank you to the community, especially Tucson or Tucson, and all of the organizations that have been doing this important work throughout the year. And I hope to continue getting to know you and working with you, and everyone take care and be safe. So Sapua, thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe we'll do about 5 minutes, and if anyone has questions, I see Christine has a question, and then Laurel, if you just want to look through the chat and see if there were any others for the panel.
My question is, there's through all this discussion, there seems like there's two threads. There's the kind of food insecurity, making sure that there's availability of food for people that can't afford it. There's also the thread of the farmers and the ranchers who need to be paid really a living wage. And those two things are in a lot of ways opposed to each other. And I was wondering if anybody, that's kind of something that I deal with. My clients are the people that can afford to pay and help create a living wage for a lot of the farmers. And in my heart, I want to be the kind of person that can provide affordable food to people that are not feeling that wealth. Is there anybody that has ideas on how to kind of combine those and help them work toward a common goal.
Audra, did you have a answer? I saw you unmuted yourself.
I have a thought, but I also want Cameron to be able to jump in too. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind with that question, Christine, I feel like it's something that we grapple with all the time, is also just the way that we see the current food system and what is purposely hidden from us, right? Like there are even though like a lot of our national food supply chain is really cheap to the consumer, there are all these costs, right, that are being deferred or paid elsewhere. And so I think about that and all of the subsidies and things, and then just thinking about like what role can anchor institutions, can local governments, can government in general play in, we already subsidize so many things. We just don't subsidize actual real local scale food production. And so, I mean, I think that's a really good question of like, how do we do that on a scale? Because it's already happening. It's just like not happening for the right things. The things that are really tied to, again, like care of people and care of this one earth that we have.
Yeah, I think that was really well said, Audra. I actually was part of something yesterday that the state of Arizona, I think, organized, AZ Health Zone, about like how state and federal partners can, you know, help like work with grassroots organizations and farmers to increase, increase food production or increase markets or whatever. And a similar, so that's just the constant question that comes up all the time. And I think Audra's point is valid, where it is, you could get into the whole mess of like what is subsidized, what isn't agriculturally, et cetera. Like, corn for ethanol that isn't for food, for example. But there's also just the question at like the community level, which is in like schools and libraries and the things that we need in our community, parks, like we fund. And I think agriculture exists in this weird thing where we do need it, but it's supposed to just be figured out on its own. And to Audra's point, there's a lot that's hidden behind that. And there's just a lot of people like, broken bodies, broken households, broken economics that kind of prop up a system that isn't very fair and equitable. And that's been true for a long time. And I think, just kind of re-envisioning about like what matters and what we need in our community, and maybe, funding it differently. I think similar, one thought that I've had recurring is just like, when we want teachers for our schools, if we don't necessarily do a great job of in Arizona, we, offer them opportunities for training in school, and then we pay them a salary, and there's a school already built, and then they have custodial staff and administrative staff, and we try to set them up to do their job well. Maybe we can certainly do better in that realm, but I think similar to food production, like there's not that same level of like community investment, at least not at the local or regional or state level, that would set farmers up to succeed. And I think if it was going to work on its own, it would be working. And the fact that it's not means that we really need to take a different strategy if we want different outcomes.
Well, and I just wonder, listening to you both talk too, and just knowing a bit about Christine and her work at Gallery of Food, I wonder if there's also ways to, I think these things, we can fall into categories of either or, and it's always like usually a both and answer, right? Like we should be doing all things. And I wonder if there are some creative ways that businesses like Christine's business can actually draw attention to the groups that are doing that kind of work and invite, people that are able to afford the food to support the system in different ways. So just throwing that out there.
I think the other thing to mention too is just like food sovereignty, and how many folks, like I know Nelda was on here before. I know folks from Las Milpitas and other like organizations that it's all about like, you can also grow your own food, right? Like that is something like also to things that Amy was talking about, this like traditional historic knowledge that is available and accessible. So how do we make that more feasible for people too, in terms of like access to land for community plots? You know, like all of those things that also ties in, because it's kind of like all a part of this access component, and that people are totally capable, able, want to, and can learn how to meet a lot of their own food needs themselves.
Well, I think, yes, Eden is putting in the chat some places to check out in the report where we talk about some of these things. I think, you know, one thing that's really clear is just as we think through all of these different issues that have come up, there's ways that we can address them. But again, yeah, it's like we need to kind of look across different kinds of knowledge, different experiences, different expertise, different types of resources in order to kind of really build this coordinated plan and coordinated system moving forward. So yeah, and I think that there's just the right amount of energy to make this happen in Southern Arizona and hopefully broader than that as well. I'd like to wrap it up here. I just want to thank again our panelists. Of course, it was really great to have your expertise on the panel today and to hear from you all directly. I want to thank all of the participants of this research project, and again, just plug that we really hope these conversations continue and that that our research going forward can help inform some of these plans and processes. And finally, also to the rest of my research team, thank you for all your work over the last year. It's been a lot of fun. So the link to check out the report is again in the chat. The executive summary should be up early next week. It's in its final design stages. So look for that there. Thank you all so much, and look forward to talking to you all in the future.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. Take care.